how many times do you go out and Google your own symptoms and you kind of play doctor at home? So now you actually have a device that you can record the symptoms and provide feedback to your care plan. It is breaking into a new technology, but it's the fact that we can play and participate in our own continuum of care.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we are speaking with Jennifer Stango, Vice President of Strategic Accounts at Argano, and we are going to be talking about a major shift in the industry driven largely by the pandemic, which is a shift towards direct-to-consumer sourcing and logistics, the patient at home getting bigger data sets and not always self-reported information to be able to guide good quality care. And I almost kind of think of this Amazon model, Hayes, every time I think about this.
Clearly, Amazon or a company like that, which I don't know of any others, they're right where they need to be to do this. And so, but she brings up some really good points. Stick around and listen to her because she's really involved in this.
All right, we're going to be right back with Jennifer Stango, Vice President of Strategic Accounts at Argano.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Jennifer Stango, Vice President of Strategic Accounts at Argano, and we are going to be talking about the impact of some major changes going on in supply chain right now, and it's direct to consumer with regards to sourcing and logistics. So Jennifer, really want to thank you for joining us and coming on the show to talk about this. Really, it's a big shift in the industry.
Thanks for having me, Justin. It is. I mean, healthcare and life sciences have changed so dramatically because of the pandemic, and it's forced so many changes in the industry that technology is just trying to respond to. So it's a great topic right now for people.
Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your background? Is like what brings us here today and what sparked your interest in, logistics and sourcing and really getting into healthcare?
So I've been in technology for a little over 15 years, trying to solve a lot of the healthcare and life sciences issues that keep coming up and trying to fix it with technology. So what brought me here today is life sciences is undergoing a vast amount of change, and it's specifically because there's a lack of product in the market, like drug substances, APIs. You just can't get them. And the movement now is direct to consumer. And we've seen more and more movement to it. And it really was brought upon COVID testing. And so think about what's happening in with the COVID test is that it's coming from somebody like Abbott. It's getting shipped to a distribution center and winding up in your Walgreens. And the scan is occurring. So you scan that QR code and you have a doctor interaction. Why is the FDA and HIPAA and PHI preventing life-saving technology coming to the market? And, that's why I'm really passionate about this subject is these things should not be available. Like people should have these technologies available to them. It shouldn't be prevented because of all the regulatory that we live in.
So when you and I had met, we talked a little bit about a story you had around DME or durable medical equipment, and we're going to use that to sort of put some framework to this conversation as well and kind of describe some real world scenarios. But why don't you talk about your personal experience?
So I hurt my knee a bit ago, and I had a knee brace prescribed to me by my ortho. And I was having a lot of issues with my knee brace. I love my Peloton, not a plug, but I was on my bike and my knee kept getting bruised. And what I did is I actually had warrantied my knee brace through the manufacturer. And when I called, I actually wound up with a chatbot, and the chatbot started asking me questions, and it identified that I'm a woman, I was underneath 5'7", and that I was pretty active in the walking and biking. And it told me, based off of asked me certain questions, it told me I needed a foam insert for my knee brace. It actually shipped it to me because it knew my address from my registration card. And it really got me thinking about this whole direct-to-consumer and med device. They had a lot of information about me and about my activity level from my warranty, plus what my ortho had told them about me. So, I mean, that is a total change. When have you ever seen life sciences companies providing that level of service?
Yeah, in an automated way. And that's really the biggest piece. I think we had to look back a little bit and say, okay, this is actually a glimpse into the future. It might be happening now, but it's definitely not happening everywhere in medical device. But this is a great sort of future state, best case scenario, best practice today. But let's make sure everybody understands just how manual of a process this used to be, and in many cases still is. What is that like, now in terms of most people's experience with getting equipment like you got?
What used to historically happen when you think about it is I would actually have called my doctor, and I would have gone into my doctor, and my doctor would have looked at my knee, seen the bruising, and he would have treated me and possibly prescribed another med device. In the new world, I was actually able to solve it with the medical device manufacturer versus my provider. But next generation of that is, in theory, they can send that information back to my provider. So maybe I was going to have surgery and I had that really bad bruising. That integration could have occurred. They could have let my surgeon know, and they could have scheduled a follow-up appointment with me, looked at the bruising, and made a determination if I was eligible for that surgery or not. And this is a whole new world that we live in.
Hey, Jennifer, I'll jump in there. This is Hayes Waldrop. Actually, I had a conversation with a guy yesterday, and we're talking about the medical devices, the wearables, and those things, kind of what we were talking about here. And the evolution, it used to be like, to your point, you had to go to your primary care or your orthopedic surgeon to get these products. Now they're being shipped directly. But to me, it's kind of interesting how perhaps the payers are going to go that way as well. And they're going to start shipping you, stethoscopes and all these different wearables that you can literally take your own vitals and send back to your doctor. So I think this is kind of where you're talking about. It's a really exciting field. And, the patient at home, hospital at home has gotten huge wheels in the last, I think, to your point, 18 months, 2 years.
Yep. Last year alone, there was a 7% increase in wearable tech for healthcare. It was fall detection, continuous glucose monitoring. I mean, this is the wave of the future for virtual care or hybrid care environments.
100%. There's several remote companies out there that are doing some really interesting things. And I think one of them you can actually purchase around $300 retail. And I think it'll do an ear exam, a pulse oximetry. I mean, it does a bunch of cool things, and it's about $300. And so theoretically that could be bundled in with the payers, I think, and makes a whole lot of sense moving forward.
I mean, it's very true. Think about it, because we're all used to possibly calling like a teledoc, and teledoc was historically a phone call. And now you can get all that telemetry data, and it could be from your glucose monitor. It could even be from your smartwatch. Now smartwatches do fall detection. So that is coming, and that is how we embrace virtual and hybrid care. And this is the technology challenges that we're trying to solve. And it's the first time healthcare and life sciences are really coming together and working together. Think about the pandemic, right? Like if you had the COVID shot, right, wrong, or indifferent, and you went in, they had a QR code that you could scan, and you could put in what your symptoms were. I had a stomach ache. I had a headache. Think about how valuable that information is to a drug manufacturer. Most people don't comply with their medication schedules. And the reason being is because of the side effects. If you can re-engineer or reformulate that drug to reduce side effects, wouldn't you have better medical compliance? And that's going to reduce hospital admissions, emergency room admissions. Is actually going to reduce the cost of care.
You know, it's interesting. I'd really been thinking about this direct to consumer being something that was most valuable to the consumer, right? Instead of having to make an appointment or trying to go through a lot of the steps to just get an answer or get some care, it was really thinking about just access. But now I'm looking at it in a completely different light in the way that it's impacting the model. How does the manufacturer get feedback on their equipment today? And it's typically, through the physician, right? If they were prescribing, a device or, any kind of method of treatment, maybe it's a combination with outpatient therapy, but they were always accessing this information, unless it was a trial or something like that, they were always accessing it through a care provider rather than from the individual. And I think a lot of times the consumers might be a little nervous about quote unquote, Big Brother and providing information. But if they knew that it was getting the information directly, from their experience with something directly to the people who make it, I think adoption would go up. Can you talk a little bit more about how this shift towards direct to consumer and this hybrid model we're really going to change the landscape? Like, because I feel like you're just starting to, pull back the curtain a little bit about the potential here.
Well, it's interesting because I think people are afraid of Big Brother, but reverse is consumer, and people don't want to be called patients anymore. It's really considered consumers of healthcare. How many times do you go out and Google your own symptoms and you kind of play doctor at home? So now you actually have a device that you can record the symptoms and provide feedback to your care plan. It is breaking into a new technology, but it's the fact that we can play and participate in our own continuum of care. It's not a doctor's telling us what to do. You wear the wearable tech, you have the device, and you're participating in it, whether it's your continuous glucose monitor or it could be a smart knee brace. It could be a smart hospital bed for that matter. I mean, think about how many times a nurse is doing rounds and having to adjust a bed. And is that a wasted effort? It is. If you had a smart bed and it adjusts automatically, aren't you increasing the continuum of care for a patient, increasing satisfaction of a clinician or a provider? And ultimately, the cost of that healthcare is coming down because the nurse can now act on value-added activities versus adjusting a bed, right? And so when you think about the consumerism of this and the fear of Big Brother is going to have my information, don't you want your doctor to know what's going on with you? Don't you want to participate that and actually really have a true interaction with your doctor than them guessing at what's happened to you for the last 6 months with your glucose, or if you're not testing at the same time, you're not providing the right information?
Well, and there's this whole conversation around augmented intelligence. And what that really is taking data and providing analytics to clinicians so that they can make decisions quicker and with a greater level of accuracy because that data is being collected not from questions that are being asked, and I know, like, I go in and see my doctor. I know when they're having a busy day, the types of questions they ask me about my chief complaint might be abbreviated because they know that they've got to get to the next patient. So gathering this data in between conversations, I can see where it's super valuable. But going back to some of these considerations for care, you mentioned some of the regulatory. HIPAA's like right at the top of that in terms of concerns, especially when it comes to wearable technology and sending that information, and storing it in the cloud. So, let's start with HIPAA, but what are some of the other considerations, as it relates to patient care? And then we can talk about maybe how we could overcome some of those obstacles.
HIPAA is a big one because, that's the Patient Privacy Act. And then you have your protected health information. Not to mention you have the FDA floating around, right? Because you have all the regulatory with the testing, whether it's a med device or a drug. But most cloud technologies now meet all of the compliance. Like you can put protected health information in it. I think the big thing is that cloud itself is protected. It's the data that's in transit. You have to secure that data from the device going up into the cloud. And most providers and think about like your cell phone now on like Apple Health or Google Health, Android Health. Those things still pass and they're collected on your phone and they are getting passed over to your provider in a secure method. So I think a lot of it's gone away. I just think that there's still an underlying fear, just like when you put your credit card online, that someone's going to steal that information. Same thing with your protected health, but technology is there today where that data is protected. And I think consumers need to understand that.
What are some other considerations in general as far as like, think about how Amazon shifted everything and eBay with the rating systems and, really getting a greater understanding of, the consumer or the customer, maybe we say the patient experience.
Yeah, I kind of call that the voice of the consumer, right? That's what Amazon did really well, is they looked at what your shopping trends were and they started proposing what you needed. You can do that in healthcare or as a manufacturer. And using that example that I had with the COVID test is they can't tell me if I was positive or negative, but they know I took the test for a certain reason. So why can't they send me a $5 coupon to go get a cold pill or some type of medication? Amazon has also created this next day concept of where I need the product. And most life sciences manufacturers or even healthcare providers aren't used to having to deliver that level of service. So what is good enough versus what is your nirvana or what is great in that concept of that voice of the customer or their service level so that they're expecting? Because Amazon has created this urgency of I need it today.
Absolutely. Amazon's totally changed our perceptions and what we should and should not want, right? I mean, and there are times, I actually order things on there and it says, do you want it tonight? And I was like, no, not really, but if you're going to deliver it tonight, I'll take it. But to your point, Jennifer, you get all this information, wearables or whatever, and you discussed about having the chat bot earlier. Well, theoretically, right? I mean, you could have all these wearables, the glucose, all that being imported to the cloud in real time. Some type of AI in the background is reading it all, not even a provider, but it could actually dictate what's sent to you, what tests you need to do yet, or, again, and all those things, right?
It can. And think about it, like we're used to reactive care versus proactive care. And when you think about all of that data and healthcare and life sciences, it's big data, right? Is that you have to, there's a lot of structured and unstructured data. So once you can get it to a structured, you can do predictive analysis. So you could look at populations of men and women in a certain age group. And so let's say it's a man in his 40s or 50s, and this is what his health looks like. He has high blood pressure. You can apply that to men in their 20s and do predictive, proactive care to prevent them from having that. And so that is the wave of the future. This is where everybody's looking at is what do you do with that data instead of being reactive care, the movement to proactive care.
And I guess through time and enough studies and enough data, they can start to your point. If you're 25 pounds overweight and 43 years old, you need to get down to X number, and therefore that'll help your blood pressure and all those other things, right?
It can, but there's bigger applications for it. So think about cancer. Right now, a lot of times you have to go in and you have an MRI and an ultrasound, and then you have to go and get a biopsy. When everybody always thinks about data as data, but why can't it be visual images? So if you could look and someone goes in and maybe they think that you had a mammogram and they think you have breast cancer, is take a look at that image and apply it towards other images of the leg. And you can determine if that's breast cancer without having to do a biopsy. This is what big data can do. And it can be images, it can be words, it can be text. I mean, the applications of this are amazing. And this is like that whole, everybody thinks about Internet of Things. It just doesn't have to be a wearable tech device. It could be a radiology department that's online and examining those images in real time against others.
One of the things too is study bias. And a lot of times we don't really get good demographic information or enough variety in the demographics when they do those studies. And so you see that bias all the time. So I would think that getting this sort of consumer aggregate information might say, hey, based on the studies, this works for men white men, in the 40s, like, hey, it's just kind of the demographic, but it really doesn't for this other population based on what we're finding on the feedback, either from the devices or the data that's starting to come in. So we should do another study and see, maybe a different prescription methodology would work better depending on the demographic of the patient. I don't think we've really gotten that far with a lot of how prescribers, especially, have looked at that when it comes to pharmaceuticals. So I could see where this would be extremely valuable.
Yeah, it keeps going back to, and you said it earlier, is that most med device or life sciences companies don't get information about their drugs unless it's a severe adverse event. And this is the first time ever, and when we say this direct to consumer, people are more involved in their care plans. And it doesn't just have to be I scan that QR code for COVID. It could now be I'm giving feedback on my maintenance medication for high blood pressure or high cholesterol, and I'm having really bad side effects, and re-engineer that, reformulate that. And you can apply it to populations. It could be white men in their 40s are having a worse reaction to that maintenance medication than women in their 40s. And so you could create two different drug products that are almost identical, but you change it based off the genetics, men versus women.
I was just going to add there. I mean, it seems to me there's the possibilities are limitless. And, you're talking about having big data. I mean, I'm even thinking about COVID, and we've got adverse reactions and problems that some people have. We've given over 1 billion shots, but they don't seem to know exactly with, through hundreds of studies, it hasn't really all gone through the same churn through the same system. So we can really spit out the right information. But to your point is if we can get it all going in the same direction, using the same metrics and all the same studies, we could really, really give some really good information and really change the way care is delivered and when it's delivered and to who's delivered to. So that, to me, that's a really exciting part of what you're talking about.
It's an interesting point that you bring up, because there was a study done after COVID, and what they made a determination of is that they weren't capturing the right information when they were testing. And so when you went in and you had a COVID test, they weren't capturing zip codes. They weren't capturing the area that you lived in. And that's why they couldn't get the right equipment or like respirators and such to the right areas. And so getting that, capturing the right information is going to allow us to get the healthcare equipment, drugs, whatever it is, to the right people, right time, right place, right? Like that. I mean, that's ultimately the goal. When you think about the triple aim inside of
which is going to impact our supply chain dramatically. Exactly what you just said right there.
I was watching this. It was really interesting webinar that someone had done, and it was about, it's a little off topic, but it was using a digital twin. And I've always thought of a digital twin in supply chain of how to disassemble a truck and look at the ball bearings and figure out what's broken in it. But their concept was, could you use a digital twin to look at supply issues? So think about what happened, I think it was like about 7 years ago, where there was like a lidocaine shortage in the United States because Puerto Rico got hit by the hurricane. Could you use a digital twin to look at your supply chain and figure out who your primary vendor is, your secondary and your tertiary, right? And look at what the metrics are and how to get that delivered in the same like SLA, right? Because pharmaceuticals, you need them within a certain amount of time and you need them at a certain potency, et cetera, right? Using a digital twin to look at the supply chain. So if it's used to come from Puerto Rico and now I need to get it from China, that's extra time. It's going to be on a shipping container. What does that mean to my 3PL, to my manufacturing group? They originally did this because they were trying to predict if a tsunami hit an island, what the best escape routes were, right? And the concept behind that, it doesn't just have to be what the escape routes are. It could be how to get to the best supplier. It could be how to provide a virtual care center in a rural population where they don't have 5G and high-speed internet like we take for granted today. I mean, the technology applications are just amazing of what you can do. And the pandemic is what brought it all. I mean, we would never be talking about direct to consumer if it wasn't.
Yeah, we moved up about 10 years in 2 years. Don't you agree? I mean, it was fast. Yeah.
You mentioned 3PL or third-party logistics, and there's also kind of taking that in-house and a CSC or a consolidated service center. Do you see like one of those winning out in this conversation, based on where we're headed with consumer direct, or will it be a hybrid? What does that look like?
I think it depends on the organization. You think about everybody's on a journey with it, right? There's what's good enough today, and then there's what's going to have to be good enough in the future, or what's great. And think about the cost of it. So what is the duration of it? How long are we going to see this inside of the market where people are moving to direct to consumer? And if it's going to be a long time, there's other things that they have to think about. Like, none of these companies are used to doing last mile shipping. So in this, I think it's always probably going to be a hybrid, because I don't think people are going to be able to open up the warehousing space to where they can do that last mile shipping, where they can fulfill the requirements or the need, the demand in all of the areas. Because unlike Amazon, where they've popped up shipping centers everywhere and they're okay overstocking, I don't think in this higher cost for a drug or for a medical device that they can provide that same level of service.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult to get to the front, that front porch. That's where we got to go, and you got to figure it out. But it does seem to me the Amazons do have it figured out. They're in a pretty good position to somehow be that distribution arm or something like that.
But you're seeing it now, like Amazon got into PillPack, right? And I think this is where life sciences or consumer goods, durable medical equipment, they're going to have to figure out who they want to partner with. And is that partner with Amazon or their distributors that they can work with to get that last mile shipment or maintain those SLAs with the customers?
Over the last decade or so, we've seen health systems and aggregation be significant, and a lot of that was because of the Accountable Care Act and really being able to control, not only control, but support the continuum of care for a patient from acute to non-acute settings. And so the acquisition and partnership with non-acute settings for large healthcare organizations that are only getting larger in the acute space at the exact same time, I think represents a lot of challenges as well. And maybe just as they're starting to get a handle on the non-acute supply chain challenges and smoothing out some of that, then comes in this direct to consumer. So what's the impact? They're already in new territory. And then there's this like almost entire paradigm shift that throws a curveball at them at the exact same time. What could maybe VPs of supply chain that are listening or directors of supply chain that have oversight over those non-acute settings, what should they be thinking about as we move into the future?
We talk about this quite a bit at my company, at least. And when you look at healthcare, they've always almost had like that just-in-time limited stock at their facilities. And I think there's a change going on when you think about like the non-acute settings, that it's an opportunity cost to not have the product there. And so I think they're going to be in a position to where they're going to start stocking more than they historically have. And that question is, are they going to stock it in their facility? Are they going to be getting warehousing space? Have they budgeted for it? What is it going to look like? Are they going to do it through a 3PL? Those are the questions they have to start asking themselves, because just in time as we've known it, and whether it's acute or non-acute facilities, it doesn't exist anymore.
All right, last question. Is this going to be a permanent change? Or is some of this direct to consumer just the fact by virtue of like workforce shortages, staffing issues, across just about every department in the hospital? They need outside help. Is it that the opportunity presented itself, but ultimately healthcare will adjust and sort of assume control of this again? Or is this direct to consumer model or shift going to be here for the long haul?
I think in some aspects of healthcare and life sciences, it's going to be here for the long haul. I think in durable medical goods, we're going to see more and more of it. It's that involvement in the relationship with their consumer. I mean, you're really not getting that durable medical good from your provider. You're getting it from the manufacturer, and that's who you have to have the relationship with. That is going to have the customer database. And I think we're going to see that is the trend in the future. I think healthcare providers are never really going to be in that situation to where they want to be in that direct to consumer model. They don't want to be involved in sourcing and logistics, but I do think they're going to partner with someone to provide that service. to the healthcare consumer. They're going to have to.
They need the data. They have to have more robust information to guide care to continue making improvements, and especially if accountable care is here to stay, because infections, side effects, readmissions, and they're squeezing every last dollar they've got, especially after the cancellation of procedures. Like, the revenues were down, and you're trying to recover revenues, but the staff isn't there to support necessarily all the cases. You get a surgical backlog that's ready to go, but you just can't deliver the service. And so, yeah, there's a revenue recovery effort, but you're only going to be able to recover so quickly. It's a horrible thing if you're recovering on revenue, but then you're getting killed on the quality back end of it because the staff isn't there and you don't have the data to be even more precise in the delivery of care.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on so many things in that sentence that just resonate.
Hayes is laughing because I do that all the time, and they give me a hard time for it. This is a great way
He's
to
a run-on sentence, just
look.
walking run-on sentence right there. But the one thing, let me add one thing in there. I think one caveat that we got to work on. Obviously, your physicians, your systems, they're going this way, I do believe. However, we still have to get the payers on board, because it creates a whole different model of treating a patient at home as it compared to going to an office visit and or a surgery center. So that's where, until we figure that payment system out, and I'm sure it's underway, I think it's going to be a little suspect a little bit. That hopefully was not a huge run-on sentence like Justin's just then.
No, not as big as a run-on for that. But I think what you said, Justin, that is a really important point, is that there's this backlog of healthcare services that are needed, and that there's not enough people to staff it. And there's such a shortage of healthcare clinicians in the market right now, and the dissatisfaction for them is so low. And one thing I wanted to mention, once again, a little off topic, but when you think about what's happening with this capturing of data, how many times do you go to the doctor and they're not looking at you, they're staring at a computer screen, and they're not really interacting with you because they're having to enter the same data in 10 different places. I think the other thing that virtual care and tracking devices are going to give clinicians is it's going to fill in some of those screens for them. So that we could reduce just one screen, wouldn't we actually see patient and provider satisfaction going up, because my doctor is going to look me in the eye versus staring at a computer screen?
Amen to that.
Had that experience. Jennifer, great job. Seriously. Appreciate you coming on the show. Anything you want to add before we wrap?
No, it was great being here. I love talking about this, and I think this is a topic that a lot of healthcare providers, life sciences companies need to start talking to each other about, versus it being the individual conversations they're having in their own facilities. I'd love to see the two come together and try to figure out how to solve this, because it's really a need that's happening in the space. Like, as a patient, as an individual, I want to have a better experience of care. And I think if it's my doctor and a life sciences manufacturer talking to one another, or a drug manufacturer talking to one another to try to figure out how to improve my experience, I'd love for them to get in the room and start having that conversation.
Fantastic point to wrap up an excellent interview. That was Jennifer Stango, Vice President of Strategic Accounts at Argano. And it's interesting, this whole direct-to-consumer piece, Hayes. There are a lot of appointments where you go in to provide information to direct care. And to Jennifer's point, that could just be provided directly in real time, might not even require an office visit. And it just kind of occurred to me as I was digesting that interview that one of the biggest costs in healthcare is simply real estate, square footage, heating, air conditioning, the rent if they don't own it. And if you're talking about reducing real estate and footprint required to deliver care, because you can actually get the information you need and interact direct to consumer or with patients in their homes, that's another cost savings opportunity, because maintaining, that square footage or that footprint, is very expensive. And especially as, healthcare organizations continue to build, renovate, and expand.
I couldn't agree more. Hospital at home, patient care at home is growing exponentially. The other thing you didn't even bring up, which is equally as important, is transportation for the patient to get to that primary care or to the hospital. So absolutely. But she brings up some really, really good points, and she's really kind of on the forefront of that. I thought she did a great job.
I did too. And that whole part about the non-acute management and how this could really shift that, just as larger healthcare organizations are getting a handle on it from the last decade of change and kind of bringing them into the fold. This is going to be something to really keep an eye on. That's going to do it for this week's show, though. As a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. We're also available on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or Spotify, and you can just search for Power Supply on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes, but to do that, you have to download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there, we'd really appreciate a rating and a review of the app because your feedback is important to the show. On behalf of Hayes and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.